It is no understatement to say that our world is hurting from the pandemic that began over a year ago. While the economic impact has been great, our focus today is not about financial difficulties experienced by many. We want to spend a few moments talking about our relationships with one another and especially those whom we have loved deeply. We have invited Dr. Hamel, a much respected psychologist who has faced her own personal traumas, to be our guest speaker for this webinar. Dr. Hamel received her PhD in counseling psychology from Andrews University and a Doctor of Ministry degree in formational counseling from Ashland Theological Seminary. One of her responsibilities is caring for and providing support for missionaries, especially during times of crisis. I believe you will understand why we have invited her to speak about finding joy in suffering, grieving for a loved one.
This past year has been a challenging and difficult year, unprecedented in so many ways. When the World Health Organization identified COVID-19 as a pandemic on March 11 last year, most of us had no idea how our lives would be impacted. My husband and 9 members of our family are in health care. On March 14, we met together to talk about how we, as a family, might be impacted by the pandemic and what steps we would take to keep safe and to keep those around us safe. We recognized that this would likely be our last in-person gathering as a family until the pandemic was over. We also recognized that healthcare workers across our nation would soon be engaged in a battle to save lives against an invisible enemy. So little was known about the virus at that time, but it was frightening to see what was happening in China and in Italy. At one point, my husband said that if the virus spread here, the way it had in Wuhan or in Italy, that we could very likely lose a family member. 12 months after the pandemic began, more than 2.6 million people have died from the virus, more than 500,000 here in the United States. And the virus is continuing to spread, and the number of people dying continues to increase. These 2.6 million people belong to families. They are missed and grieved by loved ones, by a husband or a wife, by children and grandchildren. They are someone's brother, someone's sister. These 2.6 million people belong to communities. They have friends and neighbors who also are grieving their loss. We have all been impacted by the loss of lives as a result of this pandemic. We can't listen to the news without hearing how many people have been infected and how many people have died. The death toll related to COVID-19 brings to the forefront of our awareness the sad reality that death is a part of our lives here on this earth. Our family confronted this reality last April when my brother-in-law developed a fever just 3 weeks after the pandemic began. Following guidelines, he self-isolated and began working from home. 4 days later, his symptoms were serious enough that he was admitted to the hospital. 3 days later, on Easter Sunday, he was transferred to the intensive care unit. 2 days after that, he was put on a ventilator. Approximately 20% of people with COVID develop symptoms serious enough that they need to be hospitalized, and about 5% of those are serious enough that they need to be in intensive care units. Putting a patient on a ventilator is considered a last resort measure to save a patient's life. In those early days of the pandemic here in the U.S., 80 to 85% of patients who were put on ventilators died. Like 2.6 million other families this past year, our family was facing a crisis. Each night, our family met on Zoom to get updates on my brother-in-law's condition and to pray. No one could visit him, not his wife, not his children, not even my husband. Day by day, we got the update that his condition was getting worse. My husband was working tirelessly to do everything he could to save his brother's life. But after 8 days on a ventilator, his organs were failing. His body was shutting down. With a heart rate of only 18, we feared that death was near. I could see the sadness on my husband's face when he came home from the hospital late that evening. He whispered to me as we went to bed that night, "I wrote Lowell's death announcement before I left the hospital. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to do it after it happened." Grieving the death of a loved one is a painful process. My husband and his brother are identical twins. We live next door to each other. We have Sabbath lunches together each week. My husband and his brother have practiced medicine together for years, and now they run a health system together. They are and have always been a team in every sense of the word. The thought of my brother-in-law's death brought a deep sense of loss and sadness to my heart. I could only imagine how my husband was feeling, or how his wife and children were feeling. His death would leave a huge hole in our family. Grieving the death of a loved one symbolizes the value of that individual in the lives of those who grieve. It symbolizes the place they hold in our hearts and in our lives. The pain and suffering that we experience when we grieve reflects the strength of the bond between us. It hurts when death takes our loved ones from us, and the pain we experience can penetrate the very core of our being. Our family was fortunate and blessed that my brother-in-law survived. During the night, he made a miraculous turnaround. The next morning, for the first time since he entered the hospital, his test results and his vitals showed signs of improvement. As a family, we are deeply grateful and very fortunate that my brother-in-law was among the very small percentage of patients that survived after being on a ventilator. But many others have not been so fortunate. Not only have more than 2.6 million people died from COVID this past year, close to 57 million people have died from other causes, heart disease and cancer being the leading causes of death worldwide. 50% of deaths from all causes are among those 70 years of age and older. As we face the loss of so many lives as a result of this pandemic, I think it's helpful for us to remember that before the early 1800s, 50% of all deaths occurred during infancy and childhood, resulting in an average life expectancy of only 30 years. Prior to our understanding of how to prevent and treat infectious diseases, only 10% of the global population reached the age of 60. Historians tell us that prior to the scientific era, human beings lived with the constant presence of death. That the limits of human life were actually defined by infectious diseases. Diseases like the plague, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, polio, and others. This year has been hard for all of us because COVID-19 is a new killer, an infectious disease that has crept into our lives, and to use the language of Scripture in John 10:10, like a thief who has come only to kill, to steal, and to destroy. Not only have we lost loved ones to death, we have been robbed of the privilege of visiting the sick and the elderly, robbed of time with grandparents and grandchildren, denied the privilege of sharing meals with friends or visiting neighbors. COVID is still a mysterious disease in many ways. When exposed, Some people are infected while others are not. The disease is fatal to some, while others experience only mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. The infection and death rate around the world has not been evenly distributed. Some countries have been much harder hit than others. North and South America and Europe have been the hardest hit. Age and gender are also factors. 95% of COVID-19 deaths have occurred among those 50 years of age and older, with 88% being among those 60 years of age and older. Women live longer than men in every country in the world, but men have been 50% more likely to die of COVID than women have. Prior to COVID, many of us had come to believe that infectious diseases had been conquered, diseases that take the lives of children and used to wipe out large segments of the population. Then COVID entered our world, unexpectedly, like a thief, and caught us off guard. It has set off alarms in each of our hearts that are telling us that we are not safe. COVID has brought each of us to an awareness of just how fragile life is and how vulnerable we are. The scriptures make it clear that hardship and suffering are a part of the world that you and I live in. In Romans 8:21, the Apostle Paul talks about our world being under the bondage of corruption. In verse 22, he says, "For we know that the whole creation has been moaning together as in the pains of childbirth." This past year, our world has been moaning and suffering as a result of this pandemic. But the truth is that every child that enters our world is born into a hurting and broken world, a world where nothing functions as God intended. Most parents do their best to protect their children from the pain and suffering of life. But no home is perfect, and no parent is perfect. In fact, many people are actually born into families where the pain and suffering of life begins in the home. I grew up in a family where there was a lot of conflict and tension between my parents. The dysfunction in my home led me to seek out a relationship with God, a relationship that would provide me with the internal stability and the support that my parents didn't seem able to provide. I came to experience God as a loving, caring, and protective Heavenly Father. I believed that He both heard and answered my prayers. As a young person, I had a desire to serve God with my life. While still in college, I met a young man who had the same commitment to God that I had and the same desire to serve Him that I did. We got married, and we were able to create a home where Christ was the center, a home that was free of conflict. Shortly after we were married, we received a call to serve as missionaries in Africa. My husband and I considered it a privilege to be able to serve as missionaries. We had no idea what challenges we might face or what sacrifices we might be asked to make, but we believed God was calling us. We believed He would take care of us and provide for our needs. We spent our first 3 years in Bujumbura, Burundi. The first year was hard for me, as it is for most new missionaries. There was so much to learn and so much to get used to. But after the first year, I learned to love Burundi and its people. In many ways, my adult life was shaped by my experience as a young missionary wife in Burundi. Our first son was born during our time there. During our time in Burundi, I came to see the challenges and hardships in relative terms. I'll give you an example. There were months when the water in our home would go off every morning at 5 a.m. and wouldn't come back on until after 10 p.m. Every night I would have to fill the bathtub so that I would have water to cook with and clean with the following day. Initially, I experienced this as a hardship until I took stock of the fact that most of the women living around me carried the water they needed to cook and to clean with in jerry cans or buckets on their heads, often for long distances. At least I had a bathtub that I could fill, and I had a faucet in my home that I simply needed to turn on. Looking at the situation differently transformed the hardship that I was experiencing into a blessing. How we think about the challenges we face in life makes a tremendous difference in how we handle them. After living in Burundi for 3 years, we moved to Rwanda when our oldest son was not quite a year old. Our second and third sons were born during our time there. We loved our lives in Rwanda. It was one of the happiest times in my life. Ellen White talks about a Christian home being a foretaste of heaven here on earth. That was my experience. I had a wonderful husband and 3 adorable little boys. We believed that we were where God wanted us to be and that we were doing what He wanted us to do. I didn't really experience the hardships of living in Rwanda as true hardships. Most of the hardships that we experienced were things that were a part of the common experience of the people who lived there. There were so many things that we loved about living in Africa. When our boys were 3, 6, and 8 years old, my husband and I decided to make a trip to visit Victoria Falls. We would have to travel by road through Tanzania, Zambia, and into Zimbabwe in order to get there. Travel in Africa can be challenging, especially with 3 young children. But we'd lived in Africa for 11 years by that time, so we felt comfortable that we would be able to handle whatever challenges we might face on the trip. And we prayed about the trip, and we believed that we had both God's permission and His blessing to do the trip. We trusted Him to be with us and to take care of us. We had a wonderful trip. Yes, there were challenges. Flat tires and car trouble are a part of the common experience of travel in Africa. But as I said earlier, challenges are always a matter of perspective. We were all safe, we were all healthy, and we were together as a family. That was what was most important. On the last day of the trip, we stopped for a picnic lunch at noon, and we could see the mountains of Rwanda in the distance. It had been a long trip, so we were looking forward to getting home. I remember specifically thanking God for our safe and enjoyable trip and for His presence with us on the trip. Just before sunset on that Friday evening, we crossed the Rwanda-Tanzania border. We planned to spend the night in a nearby hotel where we would spend the Sabbath before continuing our journey back to our home the following day. My next memory is awakening in a hospital bed in Belgium, not knowing where I was or how I'd gotten there. I learned that our family had a head-on collision with a truck and that my husband had already been buried in Rwanda. My 3-year-old son was 4 floors above me in the pediatrics unit. His skull was fractured, his leg was crushed, and 2 toes were missing. My 6-year-old and 8-year-old sons were still in Rwanda. They had been the only 2 family members at their father's funeral. As the reality of what had happened really sank in, I felt overwhelmed by grief. I didn't know how I would face life without my husband. How would I raise 3 boys on my own? How would I support them? Where would we live? In many ways, the hardest question for me to answer was, where was God? All of my life, I had known and experienced Him as a loving Heavenly Father. I had always trusted Him to protect me from harm and to provide for my needs. In my mind, I imagined him turning from me as our family rounded that corner on a narrow, winding road in Rwanda on that Friday evening. I felt abandoned by God. The 2 weeks that I spent in a hospital in Belgium were the 2 most difficult weeks of my life. This past year, as so many have lost loved ones, some of you may be wondering where God is in all of this. I know from my own personal experience that sometimes our loss can be so great and the pain that we are experiencing can be so overwhelming that it can block our view of God, making it hard for us to see Him with us. Yet in spite of the fallen and broken world that you and I live in, God is with us. He has chosen to make His dwelling among His people, to actually live within you and me, even in our suffering. As Adventists, we believe that before the return of Jesus, there will be a time of trouble in which the people of God will be cut off from all earthly support. This past year, as governments around the world closed their borders and issued lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, many people have turned their attention to the return of Jesus. Many have asked if they are prepared to face a time of trouble. The time that I spent in the hospital in Belgium was the most difficult time in my life. It was, for me, my own personal time of trouble. I wanted to believe that God was with me, but what had happened seemed to scream that either God was not there, or if He was, He didn't care. Many people who experience trauma or loss feel forsaken or abandoned by God. Jesus Himself felt this when He cried out to His Father while on the cross, asking why He had forsaken Him. Pain and loss can cause us to feel not only isolated and cut off from God, but it can cause us to feel isolated and cut off from other people as well. When I was in Belgium, I felt absolutely alone, cut off from everything and everyone that I had ever known or loved. It was extremely hard for me being separated from my children. I desperately wanted to be with them. When I thought about all that I had lost, I couldn't imagine ever being happy again. But I remembered the words of Jesus in John 16:33, when Jesus said, "In this world you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." These words of Jesus gave me hope. He wasn't saying that bad things wouldn't happen. We live in a sinful and broken world, a world where bad things happen. But He was saying that He had overcome the power of those bad things to hold us captive. I tried to focus on other verses that gave me hope. James 1:2 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Romans 5:3 says that we are to rejoice in our sufferings. And then 1 Peter 4:12 and 13 says that we are not to be surprised at the fiery trials that we suffer, as though some strange thing were happening to us, but rather we are to rejoice inasmuch as we are able to participate in the sufferings of Christ. From a human perspective, it's simply not realistic to think that one can rejoice in suffering. It's counterintuitive. Jesus taught many things that seem not only counterintuitive, but almost contradictory, at least on the surface. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says that the person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. So what do these verses mean? And how does one find joy in suffering? I asked God to open my eyes to the realities that I was not seeing. I remember the day that they brought my 3-year-old son into my room. He had been badly injured and had been unconscious for days. He was all bandaged up with bandages around his head and his foot and a big metal device screwed into his leg to hold the bone together. He looked like a little wounded angel. When they rolled him into my room and he saw me, his face lit up and he smiled and said, "Mommy." When I saw his face and heard his voice, my heart lit up with joy, pure joy. Having my precious little 3-year-old son with me did not take away the sorrow of losing my husband, but it was still a gift, a priceless gift. It gave me a glimpse of what it meant to experience joy in the midst of sorrow. To this day, the sound of my son's voice brings joy to my heart. Even though I didn't know anyone in Belgium before arriving there, as Christians, we're members of the family of God, a part of the body of Christ. While I was in the hospital there, the president of the Belgian conference and his wife visited us every single day. Their presence was a gift. Others also visited. I was able to experience the presence and love of Jesus through their kindness toward me. After being in the hospital in Belgium for 2 weeks, my son and I were transferred to a hospital in South Carolina so that we would be closer to family. Despite the dysfunction in my family, I loved my parents and I knew they loved me. I remember the joy I felt when I first saw them. They met us at the airport and then followed the ambulance to the hospital. I was comforted by their presence. This past year, many of you have lost precious family members. Grieving the death of a loved one is a painful experience, but the Holy Spirit can help keep our eyes open to the good things that are still in our lives. He can also draw us closer both to our Father in heaven as well as our loved ones who are still with us. The Bible presents a realistic picture of what our lives are like in a fallen world. It is full of stories of loss and tragedy, but they are also stories of God acting in and through these tragedies. The cross is the central story of God acting in and through tragedy. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all quote Jesus as saying, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." As a young Christian, I believed that Jesus was asking those who followed him to take up a cross that non-Christians were not asked to take up, or at least a cross that they were unwilling to take up. But the older I got, the more I realized that every child that is born into this world has a cross to bear. Life in our fallen world is difficult. In reality, it is full of suffering, and that suffering is not distributed fairly or equally. I came to understand that Jesus was inviting each of us to willingly embrace the burdens that we face in life. Jesus was inviting me to embrace what had happened in my life. Thousands of people die in car accidents every day. More than 1 million people are killed in car accidents each year, and another 20 to 50 million are injured or disabled. Unfortunately, what I had experienced is not unique, but is common, a common human experience. We live in a hurting and broken world where bad things happen. Not only was Jesus inviting me to embrace what had happened, he was inviting me to follow him. He has paved the way before us. The cross is not the end of the story. Pain and suffering are not the end of my story. After the cross is the resurrection. This is the gospel. the good news that we have to share with the world. Through my suffering, I came to understand the meaning and the power of the cross in a way that I could not have understood otherwise. Jesus is able to bring light and life to my wounded and broken heart. I likened what I experienced those weeks and months after my husband's death to seeing the stars in the night sky. During the day, when the sun is out and the sky is beautiful, one cannot see the stars. We may know they're there, but we can't see them. But when the night comes and the darkness settles in, we are able to see the stars. It is normal and healthy for us to grieve the death of our loved ones. At the same time, we can experience joy as we embrace the cross that is before us, and we follow Jesus. He has paved the way before us. Isaiah 53:5 says, "For by his stripes we are healed."
Julian Melgosa was born in Spain and earned his MA at the University of Madrid. His PhD is in educational psychology from Andrews University. Julian is a chartered psychologist and an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society. He is a prolific author in the area of emotional and mental health. He serves as an associate director of education for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. He is the associate editor of the Journal of Adventist Education. Julian, the pandemic has impacted everyone differently, and yet has created a unique global common bond of sorts. Everyone has been touched by it in some way. How has this changed our understanding of suffering?
Well, first we have to say that it has affected everyone. And if we move at a superficial level, we see that the pandemic has been in the mouth of everyone as a theme, as a topic for conversation, sharing concerns, listening to people on how they are coping with this stressful situation, and how they are dealing with the discouragement and anxiety that the situation is bringing to our lives as a result of COVID-19. In online ways, there has been a lot of discussion. Some of the dialogues haven't been very productive. Some of them have been full of fear, but there has been this common theme that have brought close people together. That is at a superficial level. When we go into a deeper level, then we see that this theme has brought meaningful reflections on life and death, which is something common to all. We have all witnessed that this has touched the rich and the poor, the famous and the ordinary people. The healthy and the unhealthy, all have been infected. Some have been touched deeper than others, but really every group has been touched. Some have died. And of course, at no time we have seen that this is relegated to certain social classes or pockets of population. It is true that the old one have suffered more, and those living in crowded conditions and in poverty, they have been touched more. Yet everyone has been touched. And at the end of the day, we have been reminded that death is a reality in the world we live. And many have had the opportunity to think about these transcendental questions because of the COVID pandemic. Our understanding of suffering has changed, of course, in the sense that more people have been affected. those who have suffered the effect of the virus themselves and have affected the life of the people surrounding them, family members, health providers, all of them have seen things in a depth that they hadn't seen before. And this has brought these fundamental questions. Who am I? Where am I going? Why am I here? This is something that has to have a ultimately benign effect, because we are being asking questions that before we couldn't. And of course, we need to find answers in scriptures and get the benefit that the Lord provides us through them.
Yeah, it's an interesting relationship that we have developed globally with one another through this really suffering of different kinds, I suppose. Now, I know you've talked to many people who have experienced loss of various kinds. How does someone who has had a significant loss, how does that impact an individual? And I'm not just talking emotionally, but spiritually. How do these kinds of loss impact people, both spiritually and emotionally?
Well, this is an excellent question because it provides the framework to explain the idea of loss. In early stages of psychology, of the history of psychology, there was a very simple definition of loss. And this is still valid today. The idea is that loss is the gateway to depression, because every case of depression is based on some loss. And during this pandemic, we have experienced plenty of loss. Loss of freedom, because people have been confined. Loss of plans, because people were going some places, getting together with others, doing things that they couldn't do. Financial loss for many, loss of jobs, loss of health, and unfortunately, many have found death. And of course, they haven't experienced that loss themselves, but their dear ones had to experience the loss of this life. How does loss impact emotions and spirituality? First, the good news is that in the large majority of cases, the loss of a dear one develops into a very, very painful stage of grief, but rarely equates to the major depressive disorders or the clinical depression. Grief and depression are different things. Grief causes feelings of emptiness and loss, whereas depression causes the inability to anticipate happiness and pleasure for the foreseeable future. Grief tends to decrease over days, and over weeks it gets better and better. But depression is very enduring. It just doesn't go away so easily. Grief usually happens in waves. They are called the pangs of grief, the pangs of grief. And they get intense with thoughts and memories of the deceased. Whereas the mood of depression is imprecise, is a generalized emotion of unhappiness without knowing what, feelings of worthlessness without explanation. The thoughts about death and dying that experiences the person that is bereaved is associated to that lost family member. Sometimes even the thought of joining the deceased, but not related to suicidal thoughts, like in depression is very common, that is focusing on ending the life, his or her own life. Thoughts of not deserving to live or being unable to live any longer. So the good news is that the prognosis of grief is much more positive and hopeful. Why? Because time is a great contributor to return to normal life. Sometimes more time. Some people need more time, other people need less time. Whereas depression is an illness and grief or bereavement is not. It is true that even in our language we use recovery. Experts are telling us these days, don't use recovery for grief. use terms such as learning to live with the loss, because there is no illness in grief. I believe that our Creator put mechanisms in our mind and emotional life by which that emptiness that is left by the loss get into a recovery mood, and in a rather natural way, people get over. Now, in answering the second part of the question, the death of a loved one may affect our spiritual realm too. In persons of faith, their very foundational beliefs, they may be shaken. Our prayers may not be of the same kind. Our worship, being private or corporate worship, may change in nature, and we may experience confusion. Why God permitted this sudden death of my wife or my husband or my father or my mother? Or I cannot trust God. He has not actively protected my dear one. Or I feel angry of God. A sense of isolation, a sense of helplessness. My word for these feelings is, remember, it is normal. It's not a sin. It's a reaction to the pain. And God knows that better than everyone. At the same time, and this is the positive side of this religious experience, faith and religion are an active way of coping, particularly after having passed the initial shock and traumatic step. Thoughts like, I will see him again. He is resting until Jesus will appear in the clouds. Talking to God in prayer, opening our hearts to him, telling him how one feels, and asking him for guidance and for wisdom and for patience. And finding support also in the religious community, in our minister, in our pastor, in dear people that are there to be accompanying us. This is what a loss can do to our spiritual and religious life. There is a risk at the beginning that we seem to lose our faith, but soon it can be used as a tool of support.
That's interesting. The parallel thoughts there, how they operate. When you think of suffering and joy, they really seem to be opposites. And yet some manage to find hope, meaning, and joy through that experience. How does that happen? How is this even possible to make that kind of transition?
Well, it seems like a contradiction, but we understand it better when we think in terms of the work of the Holy Spirit. The understanding of the doctrines, the understanding of the biblical promises is part of it, but then it's the work of God in our lives that will transform our pain and our grief into joy. This is the power that we heard in the statement from Dr. Hamel, that through the eyes of faith, one can look into the face of Jesus in the midst of our suffering, and that brings joy. It is a miracle. But we need to remember that there are also academic reasons to understand this. There is a need to remember that trauma and loss make religious experiences more likely to happen. Suffering can lead to an encounter with God. In the psychological professional literature, we read that those who find meaning in misfortunes cope best with traumatic events. And we also find that the neural activity in our brain, in our central nervous system, is particularly deep during times of suffering. And that is the same neural activity that can be open in a way to experience religiosity, to have a deep religious experience. So again, to me, these are mechanisms that God has provided so that in this universal tension of good and evil, we may be even getting benefit out of the evil side of things. Scriptures are fundamental in moving from grief to joy. Job's attitude is very inspiring, very affirming. When in the very first chapter of the book of Job in the Bible, we hear his testimony that says, "The Lord gave, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." That understanding that the Lord is in control can be of great help. Even though at the beginning we may rebel against God, soon after we'll be able to declare that we say, "Blessed is the name of the Lord." Just finding refuge in promises from scriptures may be an excellent tool to reach that joy. Revelation 21:4, he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Or in Psalms, in book of Psalm chapter 34, we read, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." And the most appropriate, in my judgment, for times of grief are the words of Jesus to his disciples. We find them in John chapter 16, verse 22. Very appropriate. "Now is your time of grief." Never more adequate to the person that is grieving, that is mourning. Now is your time of grief. There is time for everything. Now is your time of grief. But I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. These are guaranteed words from Jesus, and we will do well in accepting and believing. And lastly, let me tell you that there are behaviors also, not just only reading the Bible, behaviors that the bereaved person can put into practice once they have overcome the first days and weeks of mourning. Keep active, serve others, be engaged into volunteering for some project, visit the outdoors frequently, be in contact with nature. All these activities, all these behaviors will bring joy in the midst of suffering. And these are open for all of us to practice.
Thank you. Wow. A lot to think about there. But it's such a common need for all of us at different times in our life. So thank you very much, Dr. Melgosa. We really appreciate your sharing. God bless. Dr. Sandra Reed is a psychiatrist. She's Deputy Dean and Senior Lecturer in Psychiatry for Faculty of Medical Sciences at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. She is also an elder in her local church. Dr. Reed, the pandemic has impacted everyone differently, and yet you know that we are all created in a global common bond. It seems everyone has been touched by it in some way. How has this changed our understanding of suffering?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. In 2008, Farrell and Coyle coined a rather long definition of suffering. They said that suffering is a loss of control, creating insecurity associated with loss, intensely personal, accompanied by a range of emotions, involves asking why, associated with separation from the world or loneliness, often coupled with spiritual distress, closely related to pain, occurs when one feels voiceless and is linked to the deep recognition of one's own mortality. Quite a mouthful, but based on this definition, we are all suffering. We have a unique global common bond of suffering caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. This new era of suffering doesn't require us to be infected by the virus, even though the most visible suffering is the loss of life, over 3 million deaths globally to date. But on the heels of that mortality, we have massive grief and multiple public health and economic crises and strained social systems. The National Academy of Sciences estimates that for the 567,000 COVID-19 deaths in the United States, there are 5 million bereaved kin. The world is experiencing multiple losses, grief, and trauma. Grieving is painful, but necessary. It is made more painful because loss to the pandemic is sudden and unexpected, and it doesn't allow closure. It doesn't allow for close family support or the religio-cultural rituals that are needed for healthy grieving. How then do we cope? Well, first we must validate our emotions, identify and express them. There may be anticipatory anxiety, that sense of dread even before you can identify a specific loss, when you just know that things will continue to not be okay. Then there are those fluctuating emotions like irritability, denial, anxiety, sadness, and depression, loneliness, numbness, guilt, and anger. Those may be part of a grief response. Find someone to talk to or express them by writing a journal. Accepting the pandemic and its consequences and adapting to the ongoing losses and changes is part of the healing from this suffering. People should establish a routine and ensure that they have time for self-care, to eat well, sleep well, stay hydrated, and exercise regularly. And that includes stress management. Most importantly, I would say that you should not delay seeking professional help if there are warning signs like prolonged insomnia or extreme social withdrawal, suicidal thoughts or depression that affect your functioning or your relationships. If you have lost a loved one, grieving together as a family is important, even if it's virtually. Stay connected, particularly if someone is in quarantine or isolation. Niemeyer, a researcher on bereavement, tells us that somehow finding meaning and making sense out of the loss of a loved one can reduce symptoms of anger, lead to increased well-being, and reduce the risk of complicated grief. How does one make sense of a senseless death to COVID? By trusting that there is a God who is in control and exercising faith in that all-powerful God. He has given us many promises. In Psalms 22:24, he tells us, "For he has not despised the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help." He has also promised that weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. As this pandemic threatens to take everything, I end with this saying: if you lose everything and get Jesus, you lose nothing, because Jesus is everything.
Thank you. Such an encouragement, actually, but I'm so glad you are there with us today. You know, there is a question that we do have, and that is, you know, suffering and joy seem like opposites.
Yes.
And yet, some manage to find hope, meaning, and joy in the most awful situations. How is this even possible?
Yes, yes. It really does sound contradictory. Sadness and suffering are inevitable in life. And daily we are challenged to cope with loss and adversity of varying types and intensities. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought unprecedented levels of loss, grief, and trauma. And many may wonder, how can I find joy in such a situation? Emotional pain is real and normal. When we experience loss and other painful experiences, imaging studies of the brain show that the same brain regions that are activated by physical pain are activated by emotional pain. Neurochemicals and hormones are released that result in our grief and other emotional experiences. So those are real. We must cope with those negative but healthy emotions that accompany life's stresses and trials. Resilience is the ability to cope and adapt well in the face of adversity and trauma. Psychiatrist Michael Rutter defined resilience as the combination of serious risk experiences and a relatively positive psychological outcome despite those experiences. In other words, suffering and joy. He suggests that resilience is not related to any particular psychological trait or superior functioning. Rather, anybody experiencing sadness and suffering with the right resources should be able to cope and have a positive psychological outcome. Tedeschi and Calhoun further spoke of post-traumatic growth. That is, when a person experiences positive changes resulting from a major life crisis. Psalm 30:11 puts it this way: they should be able to turn their mourning into dancing. Wouldn't you like to change your mourning into dancing? Researchers describe various factors that promote resilience and post-traumatic growth. These attitudes and behaviors may come naturally, but they may also be learned through self-help or counseling. They include a more positive outlook by adjusting your thoughts from negative to optimistic. Positive thinking also brings hope. Improved ability to plan, establish goals, and be adaptable even in the midst of a crisis. Having strong social support and relationships, people you can trust in and confide in, even if virtually. Rutter also emphasized having opportunities he described as turning points that encourage new options for constructive coping in spite of previously poor coping. Successful coping in the face of trauma that promotes post-traumatic growth. Research also suggests that individuals experience post-traumatic growth when they reconstruct or reaffirm their beliefs in response to grief. A sure way to find hope, meaning, and joy in awful situations is by claiming the promises of God, all of which lead us to trust Him. My favorite verse to claim is Romans 8:28. All things work together for good to them that love the Lord, to those who are called according to His purpose. That gives me reassurance that whatever might come my way, there will be no threat, no harm, no pain, unless God intended it that way. And if so, it will always be to my benefit. Prayer activates the limbic system, the part of the brain that has to do with the experience of pleasure. And prayer raises levels of serotonin that improve our mood. Suffering and sadness will come, but when we trust God and pray, even in the midst of a pandemic, we can say, like David said to God, "You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have put off my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, to the end that my glory may sing praise to you and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever."
Wow. Such words of assurance. God's word is so important, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Thank you so much for sharing. And there is so much we can learn from each other. Thank you for your expertise and for sharing it with us today. May God continue to bless you in your ministry there.
It has been my pleasure, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.
Torben Berglund took his medical training from Copenhagen University. As both a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist, he has taken special interest in working with patients with depression, anxiety, personality disorders, as well as integrating relational, religious, and existential perspectives in psychotherapy. He is one of the associate directors of Health Ministries Department here at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Torben, the pandemic has impacted everyone differently, and yet it has created a unique global common bond. Everyone has been touched by it. How has this changed our understanding of suffering?
Well, it remains to be seen how we have changed. I think that's something we'll still have to see, and how this will impact us in the years to come. But I think for sure there's been suffering on a level that we seldom have seen, at least not in recent history, and that has been so universal that everyone basically have suffered, and that we all have lost something in one way or another, and if in no other way, then at least our way of life. Like around the world, almost everyone has been impacted by this pandemic, and it has disrupted our lives. And for some people, there have been major problems, major losses. For maybe the majority, it's been more minor problems in a way and minor losses. But I still think everyone has felt this greater vulnerability, sensitivity, the sense of being more fragile than we maybe otherwise would feel. So I think in this sense, suffering during this pandemic, it has not been just limited to the unfortunate few, which maybe in our daily life, our daily world, then it's sort of a few people who sort of we see as suffering, but basically all of us have experienced it to some way or another. And I think what it has impacted is our sense of ourselves, maybe our sense of invincibility, our sense of being strong. It has been shattered because we've all found ourselves, we've been at risk of illness, of death, of loss, and many have actually experienced these things. Interesting, in the UK, United Kingdom, there was done a study early on in the pandemic that showed that people actually were more worried about the social and mental impact of the pandemic than they actually were of getting sick from COVID-19. So that just indicates like on how many levels it has impacted us. And sometimes I talk about this, that this is not just we're not just talking about a physical illness, but this pandemic, it has truly been what we can call a bio-psycho-social and spiritual crisis and pandemic. It's truly been an existential crisis for the world, and on the individual level, also truly a crisis for most people. And in this, I think it's important to recognize that even though we've all been in the same pandemic, in a way, how we respond is different and unique. Each individual, what it means to each individual, how it's impacted each individual, that may be unique. And it's important that we understand that and allow for that, and allow ourselves also to react differently than my family member or my colleague or someone else, because the meaning of it is unique to each individual. So what I hope that we will learn from this pandemic, as we at one point sooner or later hopefully emerge from it, that at least we have learned to be more real, more realistic about ourselves, about life, and the world we live in, and that we can understand one another, be more empathetic, be more supportive and more kind to one another as we move into the future.
Wow, so much to think about, and I appreciate that. Dr. Berglund, I do have a question though. You've talked with many people who have experienced loss, some significant loss, and it's impacted them not just emotionally but also spiritually. How? I mean, how is that going to impact them? Or how can they relate to that, I guess?
Yeah, I think that we have to acknowledge that grief and accept and appreciate that grief, it is a normal and healthy response to loss. Strength is not to grieve when we experience the kind of losses that people have experienced. And with that, with loss, there comes sadness. There can be also other kinds of emotions like fear, like anger over what was lost. And at the same time, which may to some seem a bit paradoxical, but like they can also be positive emotions as one appreciates, remembers the good things that one experienced. And in this process of dealing with loss, grieving, again, we have to understand that how it is experienced, the intensity, the process, and the duration of grief also is very individual and varies from person to person. And this can be a challenge also sometimes in relationships or family context or wherever that is, where sort of one has in a way experienced the same loss. But the process one goes through differs significantly. I think a good metaphor for grief is like waves on an ocean. At times it can be a full storm, a raging storm. Other times it can be a gentle breeze. And that's how the process of grief often is. And it comes and goes like the weather on an ocean comes and goes, it differs. That's how it often is in grief also. And then it can be a challenge sometimes if one goes through the same loss, but one is at different places in the process. But I think it's important to accept and acknowledge is that the grief process cannot be controlled. I think grief is not sort of an orderly process where you go through one stage after the other until you emerge and then you're done and over with it. That's not how grief works. One maybe used to think so, but we've sort of abandoned that kind of thinking. Grief, the emotions, they come and go, and these different aspects of grief, they may come at different times. What I think that grief really should be, and we should allow it to be that, and we should give people space to that, is that grief really can be a time out in life where one reflects on what was, what is, and what is to come, and that you don't run through or rush through or escape any of these things. You need to spend appropriate time both reflecting on what was, what is, and what is to come. And in that sense, what also many people experience is a spiritual crisis in times of grief, in times of loss. And I think for me, one of the great books, resources on grief is C.S. Lewis, who wrote the book A Grief Observed after he lost his wife. And if I may, just I think he shares so well this spiritual aspect of his own crisis in that. And in the beginning of the book, he says, like, meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. And he says, like, go to him. Like, this is still C.S. Lewis talking. Go to him when your need is desperate, when all help is vain, and what do you find? And his experience, a door slammed in your face, a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence becomes. There are no lights in the windows. It might be an empty house. Was it ever inhabited? It seemed so once. And that seeming was as strong as this. What can this mean? Why is he so present a commander in our time of prosperity and so very absent, a help in time of trouble? This is like C.S. Lewis, the champion of faith, who for himself, when he went through the grief, the loss of his wife, had these deep questions and experiences of where God was not as close and as present as he wanted. And he said there also about himself that not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not so there is no God after all, but so this is what God really is like. Deceive yourself no longer. He fears that he will come to see God as not this present, compassionate rock to lean on in times of trouble, that God will be absent. And I think this journey that C.S. Lewis was on, the very honest journey where he like wrote these things down, he expressed it, he talked with God, he raged about these things also, but he allowed himself to go through the process. He found a resolution eventually. And I think that is the challenge to all of us. Also, that we have to allow ourselves to go through the emotions, go through the thoughts, not give up in the midst of this, but just keep going, and then in the end that we can find the resolution, we can find our way forward in life as well as in our relationship with God.
Yeah, you mentioned several points there that were so important, at least for me. It was helpful for me to see taking time out for the grief and allowing that to take place. I also found it very helpful to hear talk about the storm and how I visualize waves coming, some more intense than others, not always steady, but coming surges, ups and downs, and I appreciate that insight. As we think about suffering, there's this idea of suffering and joy. They seem almost like opposites. And yet somehow some are able to manage to find hope. Whether we call it hope or joy, we begin to find that in the midst of the situation, there can be both hope and joy, even during this difficult time. Is that possible? How is it possible?
Well, I think it's very possible because that's how our minds work. That emotions, feelings, states of minds are not mutually exclusive, and you can have these feelings at the same time. That's very possible, and especially in grief, that is possible. Sometimes we sort of equate the experience of grief with depression. And there are many similarities. Many of the symptoms are similar. But whereas depression typically becomes like a cloud that covers everything, there is no light breaking through at any time. In grief, it's different because we're still able to experience positive emotions also in the midst of grief, and that's okay. Sometimes people struggle with that. They may even feel bad conscience because they can feel joy, they can feel or they can laugh, or have these other positive experiences, emotional experiences, and that's perfectly okay. It doesn't mean that you are sort of grieving any less, or that you're not taking seriously the loss that you have experienced.
We shouldn't feel guilty. You're saying we shouldn't feel guilty for having joy and hope and sadness combined.
No. And like it's important, like, to allow oneself that it's okay. It's an indication of healthy grief. If you don't feel any sadness, if you don't feel any loss, if there's no negative emotions, that's probably not a healthy indication. If you don't feel any positive emotions at any time, that may be an indication that you maybe are experiencing, you develop more of a depression, and may need help for that also. But it's like allowing ourselves space for both. I think that's important. And I think it's possible when you're able to keep perspective on life, realizing that even though you've suffered loss, and you may have suffered major loss, then still that doesn't mean that everything is lost. Hopefully, throughout the process, you are able to appreciate the things that are not lost also, and appreciate the good things that you actually had. Also, those are good things. It's good indications. It's healthy functioning to do that. But again, not expect things to be just steady. That you will feel sadness and joy at the same time. These things come and go, and as we said, it becomes as waves all often. That in the midst of the storm, there may be huge crushing waves of sorrow, of grief that you may be experiencing, but maybe once in a while you spot the sun and the rays of sun breaking through the clouds, even in the midst of the storm. That's how I think grief can be, and a healthy grief can manifest itself that way.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Torben. We appreciate your sharing, and a lot to think about here. I found a lot of encouragement here, and some anticipated mixed emotions. So thank you so much for sharing. Really, really appreciate it. God bless.
Thank you.
Elaine Oliver is a licensed clinical professional counselor. She holds master's degrees in clinical mental health counseling, counseling psychology. She has completed her coursework for PhD in educational psychology. She is the Associate Director of the Department of Family Ministries for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Elaine, welcome.
Thank you. Thank
We
you.
have, we have talked to many people, and we know you have too, who have experienced loss. So I have a question. How does significant loss impact an individual? And I'm not just talking emotionally, but also spiritually. How does a loss make that impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And this past year during the pandemic, we've seen so much grief and so much loss. Some of the loss has been more tangible and some of it has been more ambiguous, loss of our normal routines, but certainly loss of loved ones has been a big deal for people this year. Due to the pandemic and other illnesses. And so indeed, we've seen a lot of loss. And it does impact people mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And so when we talk about mentally, we talk about people's mental health. And so we've seen so many people with just deep grief and deep sadness. Anxiety levels are on the rise because there's just the unpredictability of what's going to happen or what is happening. We're not used to it. But the part that you said that's so critical, Larry, is how it impacts us spiritually. And for many people, what our faith should do for us in an ideal sense, it should prepare us for this unpredictability. It should prepare us for the unknowns of life. But oftentimes when we're confronted with grief in such a deep way, it shakes our faith, it rocks our faith. And it often reminds me of a question that our daughter asked us when she was about 8 or 9 years old. We were having family worship. Actually, I was home alone with the kids. My husband was traveling that day. And she asked me this question. She said, "Mom, what if all of this isn't true?" We were talking about, God and God being there for us and us having a strong faith in God. And she said, "What if this isn't true?" And I thought to myself, wow, like, why do you ask me the hard questions when your father is away, But I prayed and I asked God, what do I say to this child that will support and affirm her faith? And I got this response that I believe only came from God. And I said to her, "Sweetheart, what if it is true and we didn't believe?" So our faith is rocked when we're confronted with things not going the way we want it to. And what I wish for all of us is that we could lean into believing more, deepening our faith. So I know you didn't ask me for an answer, but because I'm a therapist, I have been pondering these things. And so, our faith gets shaken and we're tempted to stop believing because then we start thinking, well, is there really a God? Is this really true? Was it really worth it believing when I've lost my loved one or I've lost my job or I've lost my home? And what I want to say to people is that, yes, this is where our faith gets put to the test. This is where we put God to the test, if you will, and we hopefully can trust in him more, knowing that we have to somehow hold close that tension of doubt with our belief.
Yeah, you've said so much there that is so true for all of us, isn't it? And I think your daughter has raised a very important question, and one that I've heard repeated numerous times. Where is God when I'm hurting, when these kinds of things happen? It raises another question, though, in our mind. You know, suffering and joy seem like opposite. And yet there are those individuals who seem to be able to find hope and meaning and joy even during the most difficult times. How is that possible, or is it possible?
Yeah, so this is where, as they say, the rubber really hits the road, right? Because it's so easy for us to have a heart of praise and gratitude when God is blessing us. And we thank Him and we're grateful. But suffering is a part of the Christian journey, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, especially for us mental health people and people who are in the helping professions, pastors even, we often believe that our work is to alleviate suffering, to help people feel better, because this life on earth in contemporary society, we're all about well-being, right? We always talk about mental health, good mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, and we forget that we're on a continuum. We all are. And there are going to be moments of joy. But how do we praise God in times of grief and loss and suffering? Is that a part of our journey as well? Well, the Bible tells us it is. In this world, we will have trials and tribulation. And the Apostle Paul talks about this suffering. And, you know, in Romans 5, I believe, he talks about the fact that there actually could potentially be a good end to suffering, that it might even be a good thing because our suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces what? Character, and that character produces a transforming hope, right? So that's how we hold that. It's a tension that we have to lean into. And what I often say to people, it's so difficult. And you know, we have to work with people where they are. You know, you don't come into someone who's grieving and say, oh, you need to find joy. You need to find gratitude. So it's a process. We have to sit with people. We have to feel where they are and help them lean into this suffering and into that pain. And so helping people to understand that we can actually hold the tension of suffering and hope and joy at the same time. And I have found that gratitude helps us to do this. You know, I lost my grandmother, who was like my mother. She raised me about 11 years ago. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't miss her. And she was just such an incredible person of faith. And one of the things that I have learned in my grief when she passed is to be grateful for the time that I had her, to be grateful for the fact that she is the person who most influenced my faith. And so if we can thank God during our suffering, we can find small things to be grateful for. We find ourselves, it doesn't take away the pain, but it helps us to move outside of ourselves and to allow God to break into our pain and to soothe us and to soothe our grief.
So much to think about. I appreciated the passage you shared in Romans, because this is all about character building, isn't it? And helping us through that.
That's absolutely right.
I want to thank you, Elaine, for your sharing today and for the ministry that you and Willie have provided for so many families around the world. May God continue to bless you both.
Thank you so much, Larry. God bless you too.
Helen Golfan is a graduate of Mountain View College in South Philippines with a Bachelor of Science degree in Commerce, majoring in accounting. She has used that training in a variety of positions. Her late husband, Alberto Golfan Jr., served as pastor, church administrator, with his last responsibility being the president of the Southern Asia Pacific Division. Helen, when you lost your husband, it wasn't easy, and no doubt you had questions. How did it affect you emotionally, and how did you deal with it spiritually? Helen Golfan is a graduate of Mountain View College in South Philippines with a Bachelor of Science degree in Commerce, majoring in accounting. She has used that training in a variety of positions. Her late husband, Alberto Golfan Jr., served as pastor, church administrator, with his last responsibility being the president of the Southern Asia Pacific Division. Helen, when you lost your husband, it wasn't easy, and no doubt you had questions. How did it affect you emotionally, and how did you deal with it spiritually?
Oh yes, it has affected me greatly, both emotionally and spiritually. We know that a loss is a personal matter. The closer you are attached to the person, the greater the hurt and the pain of loss. This is true when I lost my beloved husband due to a multiple myeloma, a cancer of the bone marrow. We were married for 38 best years. He was a God-fearing man, such a gentle, loving, and a caring husband, a father to our 3 children, and a faithful leader in our church organization. We enjoyed our relationship and our teen ministry so much. Few days after the funeral, all the family members and friends were gone, and I was alone in our bedroom. And I was so angry, asking God, why did you allow my husband to die? See, I'm hurt, I'm alone, I'm in pain, and I'm lonely. Why did you allow it? And the other biggest question that I asked God was, why did you not answer our prayers? The prayers of the General Conference leaders, the prayers of our division officers and workers, the prayers of friends and others, the prayers of the church members, practically all over the world. Why? You said, I doubt you because you said, if you ask, or you may ask anything in my name, I will do it. But why did you not? My wounded emotions really affected my spirituality. I don't find joy and a delight in talking to Him, in praying, or even in, opening His Word. No, because I was doubting Him. He was quiet. For a few days, and I thought, oh, God is quiet. He is not answering my questions. But no, He was just waiting for me to be ready for his answer. So one morning, early in the morning, as if he was talking to me and telling me, you know, Helen, I was in pain. I was also hurt. I was lonely when I allow my only begotten Son to die on the cross for you and for others. So, in that moment, I really felt the heart of God. I said, oh yeah, God understands my feelings. So he answered the first question in the light of the cross, and the other question was in the light of how God answers our prayer. It is either yes, no, or wait. And I remember Jesus when he prayed, not my will, but thy will. So in that moment, I accepted it and I submit myself to him. Then I started opening the Bible again and did my morning journaling.
Helen, let me just ask you at this point, because I knew your husband. I met him. I visited him in the hospital, as you know. And I guess what you're answering now is the question that many people are asking, and that you went through these questions. Where did you go from here? Where did you find the joy, the hope that I know that you have found? Where did you go? And I think you were just going to share that, and thank you for doing that.
Okay. So actually I was confused and I don't want to go out because of my new status. I was perplexed and I was not really happy about it. But then 2 weeks after the funeral, the division officers and the workers encouraged me to go out, to travel to my appointment in one of the unions having the union-wide women's convention. I was one of the speakers there, but I told them, no, I cannot do it. So we invited Mrs. Heather Donsmall to go to South Philippines. But then I decided that I will go with the encouragement of our officers and co-workers here in the division, and so I went. While there, I met Pastor Joseph Small, the husband of Mrs. Heather Donsmall, our GC Women's Ministries Director, and I learned that he is certified counselor. And so I listened to him. He said to me, Helen, just go through the stages of grieving. So I remember he said the stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Just go through it. Be angry. Cry if it comes. And then I started going out with friends, with family members, just a small group at first. We went swimming, we went to some gatherings, I started to go to church, back to church again, but with difficulty, of course, because I was angry and I was questioning God at that point. And then I also started studying His Word, and His promises came afresh to me again, and my confidence came back. Then after 3 months, we transferred to the house Pastor Gulfan has built, and we started the care group because that is one of his dreams, building the house. So we started that, and many souls accepted Jesus as their Savior and Lord.
Amen.
And yes, and then we continue that until this time actually. And then I engaged also in gardening and playing tennis. That is my physical exercise. And interestingly, I began raising chickens as my pets, and I enjoy, learning their characteristics every day as I see them. And I eat healthy foods, and most of my leafy vegetables come from my backyard gardening. I also help widows and those who are in need. I prayed for them, I encouraged them, and help provide for them. Then I also practice stewardship and generosity. I just, I'm just feeling I feel happy, satisfied when I give and share with others.
Helen, you've.
Then,
Oh, go ahead.
yes,
Go
for
ahead.
the last one. And
Okay.
finally, I maintain a close connection with my family members and also my friends.
Those are all very helpful points that you've done. Thank you for sharing that. I know this has been difficult for you, but I also know that as you and I have worked together, we're helping other people go through this, that you have grown stronger through this experience. So Helen, thank you very much. Appreciate so much you sharing, and may God continue to be close to you and comfort you in the days ahead. God bless. Solomon Mafosa is a Zimbabwean national and longtime church administrator. He received his Doctor of Ministry from Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. He has served in numerous positions in the church, but is currently the president of the Southern Africa India Ocean Division. Solomon, welcome. We have a question for you, and that is, you've experienced a pretty sad loss when you lost your wife some time ago. I know that this was a very difficult experience for you. We've talked about that. What were the biggest questions that you faced at that time?
Oh, Larry, that's a difficult question to ask, but I'll share with you what questions I was asking the Lord. Actually, when I lost my wife, my prayers changed somewhat. Those few days after, I was just asking God, why? Why did God allow my wife? Why would He allow such a thing to happen to my wife? Just to introduce or to say who my wife was. My wife was an evangelist in her own right. She loved mission and she was very passionate. There are many people who are in the church today because my wife worked for them. So she really was with me in the ministry. And when she got sick, she had visited a non-Adventist church, and she was going to go and introduce our literature there because she was also doing part-time literature ministry. She herself was an accountant with an MBA, but part-time she would do this literature evangelism. So she made that appointment and then took ill. So I would ask God, but God, why? Doesn't your word say the laborers are few? Don't you tell us to pray for more laborers because the fields are white with harvest? It was, and I would just break down and weep before the Lord. So I really did not understand why God would allow such a thing to happen. I would look at my own ministry. Honestly, Larry, I've done my best for the Lord. For all the years that I've been in the ministry, I've done my best for the Lord. And so I would ask him, but Father, why? Why at my age? Why at my age? you would understand that the older you are and the more years you have spent with your wife, she becomes more than a wife. She becomes even more than a sister. You just become one. And so those are the questions that I would ask God. But why? But why? So that's what I went through. And the Lord did let me ask those questions. And I would expect him to answer. And each time I would go to the Word of God and read. Somehow I would find myself gravitating to the book of Daniel and also to great controversy, particularly the last chapter, that last paragraph where Ellen White says the great controversy is ended. I loved that chapter.
Yes.
It really gave me such comfort that one day these things will be over. I don't know whether I've said more than you had asked for, Larry.
I remember the time very well, Solomon. It was a sad time for all of us, and we felt really for you. It raises the question, though, how did you find meaning and hope, maybe even joy in suffering? Was that possible? When you lose a loved one, how did you find hope?
Yeah, you know that, Larry, I would talk to the idea of hope more than I would talk to the idea of joy. Perhaps
Mm-hmm.
maybe I do not understand what exactly the word joy means. Hope, I found that in Daniel 2. That chapter helped me so much. I would look at Daniel 2 and look at all those kingdoms that came and passed as predicted, everything very accurate. The Babylonian kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, went past. The Medes and Persians came and went. The Grecian kingdom came and went. The Roman India kingdom came and went. Now I would look at the feet and I would say, just as the other kingdoms came and went, surely the kingdom that is represented by the stone that is cut off from a mountain, not with a man's hand, that one is truly coming. And that gave me life. That gave me hope. It also resonated well with the book Great Controversy, the last chapter, when Great Controversy is ended, when Christ has come, the destruction of the wicked, when there will be no more death. Those were the things that gave me hope. The Word of God, it came alive. Daniel 2 in particular, and the book Great Controversy. You know, I would read the Great Controversy on the second coming of Christ, going to the next chapter that talks about the 1,000 years in heaven and all of that. And then that talks about the coronation of Jesus, and particularly that last phrase where Ellen White says, the great controversy is ended. I would long for the time when the great controversy would be ended. And that's what I'm longing for. And that's what keeps me, smiling from the heart, because I know as surely as the kingdoms came and went, one day the great controversy is going to end. And one day there will be a resurrection morning. That's what kept me alive. The hope of the soon coming of Christ.
Such a powerful word, that word hope, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Solomon. I know you live that way too. Solomon, we wish to thank you so much for your time with us. What a blessing that has been. May God continue to bless you in your ministry and in your life.
Thank you so much, Larry. I appreciate the ministry and appreciate the time to have been invited to be part of this great program. Thank you so much. May God bless this ministry.
Thank you. Janice Cameron is no stranger to having grief in her family. In fact, this last year has been an especially difficult year. Janice comes to us from Australia, where she has been a relief primary teacher for grades kindergarten through 6th grade. So Janice, tell us a little bit about how this last year has been so difficult for you and your family.
Well, this year I actually lost my uncle who died during COVID, and because I'm actually, even though I live in Australia, I actually come from New Zealand, he was my favourite uncle, and I couldn't go back to be there at the funeral, to be with loved ones, so that made it quite difficult. But the reason I guess I'm here mostly for is the fact that in 2009 my father was hit and killed by a non-licensed driver and hit and run, and my father died 3 hours after being hit. And that was very tragic for our family. Do I go on more with what else happened?
Sure, tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, well, I was teaching at school and the principal came to me and she said, I thought I was in trouble, and she said, your father's been hit by a car. And the police were already there at the school and they drove me to the hospital, and we arrived at the same time. And unfortunately, 3 hours later, as I said, he passed away. Those words that the doctor said to us will stick in my head forever, is like, your father has received non-sustainable injuries and life-threatening injuries rather. And yeah, we were devastated. But not only that, 8 months later, I found my mum dead on the kitchen floor, and she had suffered a massive heart attack. And in that same week, I lost my father-in-law. And so we struggled a lot to lose 3 parents, 3 grandparents to my children, all within 8 months. So yes, it was a very hard time for us all. The driver was then taken to court. He got off scot-free. However, as Christians, we believed in forgiveness and we forgave him in court. There wasn't a dry eye in the house, and we felt that it wasn't just for his benefit, but it was more for ours, that if we held on to the bitterness and the anger that he had given, by taking our father, that we would only destroy ourselves, not him. So,
Janice, this is tragedy upon tragedy. Tell me, Janice, how have you moved on from there? What steps, what have you done to move past your grief?
Well, I guess the forgiveness was a big thing. And also having a faith in God has been a second thing, because a lot of people, even Christians, had even said to us, "But why do you still believe in God when all this has happened to you?" And I was kind of horrified that they would even say that. But, for me, I believe saying that, when Jesus said those footsteps, saying is that, through the tough times where there's only one set of footprints in the sand. Right. And he said, that's when I was carrying you. And I felt like God carried us through that time. And as hard as it was for us, we felt that as Christians, we were going to see our parents again. We had that faith that Jesus said he's coming back again, and that he would also raise those who had fallen to, in death. So I kind of had this Bible verse that I remembered that sorry, I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this one. But, yeah. And regarding the question, friends, that has come up about what happens to those already dead and buried, we don't want you in the dark any longer. First off, you must not carry on over them like people who have nothing to look forward to, as if the grave were the last word. Since Jesus died and broke loose from the grave, God will most certainly bring back to life those who died in Jesus. And the fact that my father and mother both believed in Jesus was very much a factor in us getting over it. And also I think family has been a big factor as well. Like, I also now have a granddaughter, and the sadness that we don't get to show them and mum and dad get to meet her and one coming next month. We just know that we'll be introducing them to them in heaven in a beautiful reunion, and that's what we look forward to.
Well, thank you, Janice. What a story. And we are thankful for this sharing that you've done. Thank you, and may God continue to be with you, Janice.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Williams Costa Jr. comes from Brazil and is an outstanding musician and composer. He is serving as the Director of Communications for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. He is also the Executive Director of Adventist News Network. Welcome, Williams. So glad that you could be with us today. This has been a really difficult year for all of us, but I know that has been especially difficult for you and your family. Tell us a little bit about why this is true and what's made it so difficult.
One of the reactions that we have when we see something unexpected is the fact that this is something for someone, not to me. That tragedy affected that family, that person, but not me. But with COVID, we have been surprised. My family, myself, with many situations that were so close to us, Larry. In August, we had my aunt. She died for COVID. After 2 months, we had a cousin that just died from COVID. Then in November, my wife's mother also died. It was not COVID, but it was, problems with the heart. Then in January, Sonetti's father died. So with so many deaths, with people close to us, it was such an impact. Plus many friends, many people that we said, well, it is not possible. It was possible. So suddenly we faced lots of situations of grief and pain inside our home and in our family.
So much at once makes it extremely difficult. One of those alone would be enough to make it even more difficult. But then you add it all together. Williams, what steps have you taken to move forward with regards to the pain of loss? How have you begun to find healing from this series of tragedies?
Well, in this particular case, when we are recuperating from one impact, there was another wave and another wave and another wave. In this case, we have a tendency to be powerless because what can we do? How can we change the circumstances? And because some of those things affected directly my wife, it was a huge impact, especially on her. Of course that I felt the impact, but on her, in 86 days, she lost her mom and her dad. And the tragedy is that her dad has been with us in vacation. In January, we had wonderful time, but suddenly he had COVID, and through many other complications, we had this death situation. What I discovered through this circumstance, Larry, is that my wife, that is a dedicated wife, consecrated person, she stayed relying on prayer more than I ever saw in her life. She also took time to pray, to study the Bible, to read the spirit of prophecy. But during the last days, I saw her in the middle of night being for 45 minutes, 1 hour, praying. Then early in the morning, long prayers. Then before coming to bed, long prayers. And many times during the day, I invited her to pray with me, and both of us pray together. We intercede for the families and also for friends that we are suffering. And I can testify the power of prayer. The lost was not substituted, but the peace, that peace that humans cannot understand, it's a possible experience if we rely in God. He gives the comfort, He gives the courage, He gives the strength for us to face those undesirable circumstances. I'm not saying that we are experience full joy, but we are walking through the valley of death. And we have the comfort for the word, from the word, and the comfort from this connection with God through prayer, that it's possible for us to walk through this valley and survive. God is good. We understand that all of this is consequence of sin. And we have this hope that very soon we'll be with Jesus in the clouds of heaven. And then we will meet our dear ones, her father, her mother, my cousin, my aunt, and many other friends that we lost during this time of pandemic. So connection with God and faith in Him is the best solution through these difficult times.
You know, I remember some of the hymns or songs that you have composed, and hope was a theme, and it really came through very well in those times. I remember even learning about your concern for your wife because of all the loss she has, and I remember writing you, and I remember the support that was out there for you and others that I've known who have gone through this. I just have one more question for you, and that is, during these times of grief, how important, how supportive is it when others are praying for you and you know that you have their support? Is that helpful in your time of grief?
Absolutely. And the personal touch and the friendship is also indispensable. In a sense, I praise the Lord that all this time I have been working from home. I can't imagine how she will face all these circumstances for me traveling like I usually to do for my work. But because of the pandemic, I was supposed to be at home. And many times I embraced her. I call my children and their spouses, and we try to connect and give encouragement. At the same time, it's amazing how the Holy Spirit can work to minimize pain. We don't forget, we still remember, we miss, there's a loss, but there's comfort.
Yeah.
And that's what it's possible. What can we do? We cannot resurrect people. We don't have this power. But God can be on our side when we are in the darkest moments in the midst of the valley.
Right. So true. And our prayers will continue for you and for others that we know about who are going through these valleys as you've referenced. So thank you so much for sharing, Williams. And I suspect that future compositions will even talk more about the hope that can be recovered. So thank you so much. May God continue to bless and lead you, your wife, and your whole family. in this time. God bless. Audrey Anderson trained for ministry at Newbold College in England. After working as a legal editor in London and later running her own communications company in Sweden, she served as a pastor, executive secretary, and a number of departmental roles in Sweden. Today, she is the executive secretary of the Trans-European Division. Audrey's husband was killed in a tragic accident a few years ago, but also recently she lost her father to a non-COVID related illness. So Audrey, I have a question for you. You know, this has been a difficult year for all of us, but how has your loss created difficulties for you? What kind of impact has this experience of losing your loved ones, how has that been on you?
Well, based in St. Albans, just outside London, we have been on lockdown at the time of recording for 393 days. And lockdown has varied. When we began, it was we could go out 1 hour a day to exercise, and that was it. And no one expected it to last this long. We were told maybe a month, 6 weeks, 2 months, and that would be it. COVID would be a thing of the past. And so initially, lockdown and COVID didn't impact. But having spent, normally, I spend 150 days a year traveling. And so suddenly, to be grounded, to be home and to be alone was a new experience. And it made me realize again the fact that I was alone. And this is something that I've discovered. As you experience loss, you don't just experience it once, you experience it again and again in different situations. And so for me, it was to stop, to reflect, to acknowledge the loneliness and the aloneness, and then see, what did I do? So for me, I used the tools that I had learned when my husband had died, and I also began to look for blessings. And so on my walks, I would look for the signs of spring. I would look for the flowers. I would look for the small things, and I would practice gratitude. As you said in your introduction, my dad died on the 29th of December last year. And in August last year, he fractured his spine and was paralyzed. We brought him home in September. And for me, COVID was a blessing. Normally I would be traveling, and I was able to move home, be with my parents, work and help support and look after my father. And so for me, it has been a time of relearning lessons, relearning the importance of stopping, acknowledging how I feel, recognizing it, giving it to God, recognizing the presence of God, and looking for the blessings. And you know, even in situations of loss, there are blessings. And for me, the greatest blessing was, or is, the presence of God. God is here, and God never, ever fails.
Those are such precious words. You've obviously been working on processing your grief over a period of time now. Are there specific steps that you have taken to move beyond the pain of loss and to find healing? You've mentioned some of those. What would you say are some of the steps that you've taken to help alleviate some of the pain of loss?
Well, Larry, I wouldn't actually say that you ever move beyond loss. I would say you move forward with it. you know, everyone experiences grief differently. And my experience is unique to me, but yet there are some commonalities. And when you experience grief, or for me, it was when my husband died, when my father died, it's like someone has taken time and they've ripped it up. They've created a gap. And, you know, it's now 4.5 years since Lars was killed in an accident. And that gap between the time that we shared together and now is getting larger and larger every day. And so he left something that can never be replaced. No one else can ever come in and fill. Other people can come around, and I learned to move forward with the blessings and the experiences that we enjoy together, and they have made me who I am. And then I move forward, but I have to move forward without him. I have to move forward without my dad. So for me, the steps were, one, to actually acknowledge the loss and to recognize that this is a new reality, to acknowledge that things have changed. They will never, ever go back to what they were. But that change gives me an opportunity to grow. That I recognize there will be good days and there will be bad days. You know, when we talked earlier, I said, when you experience loss, you process it time and time again in different ways. Grief comes at the time when you least expect it. You know, a gesture from someone, a word, a smell, all of those things can trigger a memory, and all of a sudden you can feel happy at that memory and sad. And it is just to accept that this is something that you are going to move forward with for the rest of your life. It also is something I've learned, which I found extremely difficult, is asking other people for help. I was in Cyprus on a business trip when my husband died, and I had to travel back to Sweden. And when I was on the last leg of my journey, I was in an airport lounge and I was very upset. And one of the assistants in the lounge asked me what she knew me, because I'd been in there often. And I told her my husband had just been killed. And she stayed with me and she walked with me to the gate. And as she left, she said, "Let me give you a piece of advice. Ask for help. People will not know what to do. And they will want to help, but they don't know how. So don't be afraid. Ask for help." And I found that by asking people for help, I have opened doors to be able to build new relationships, to give people an opportunity to minister to me, and also for me to minister to them. And so asking for help is, for me, a very important and sometimes something that we don't do. Then also recognizing the presence of God and the goodness of God. You know, bad things happen, but the bad things don't come from God. We live in a sinful world, and sin brings grief, loss, death. But God is always there, and God is still good. And so I come back to what I mentioned last, learning to express gratitude, learning to look for that goodness, and learning to recognize it and to share it with others, to tell others about the goodness of God. Because I can honestly say that although I would not choose to live without my husband, the last 4.5 years have been years of blessing, years when I have got to know God in ways that I would never, ever have got to know him. So although something bad happened, something good has come out of it.
Audrey, what a testimony, but also what important insights and thoughts for all of us to consider. You've been through a lot. You've grown a lot. May God continue to be with you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Dr. Frank Hassel is originally from Germany. He is a theologian, professor, author, and currently serves as an associate director of Biblical Research Institute. Frank lost his wife in 2009 due to cancer. In his recent book, Living for God, he explores the beauty of simple biblical virtues such as gratitude, courage, patience, humility, living through suffering and loss, and more. Well, Frank, it's been quite an experience, I know, for you to have lost your wife. What were some of the biggest questions that you faced because of that loss?
There is a wide variety of questions that swirl through your mind when you're confronted with significant loss in life like that. When you lose your life partner, your best friend, your spouse, you have all kinds of questions that cross your mind. One of the big questions is, of course, what am I doing now? Who am I really? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my life? What does that mean for my future? Questions like, who am I now? There are so many questions connected to that, but the question who I am really is an important question that crossed my mind. All of a sudden you face yourself to be in a different social category. Up until then, you were in the category married. You lose your spouse. All of a sudden, you move to a different social category. You no longer belong to the people who are married. You no longer belong to that group of people. You are now in the category widowed, and you're single. And what does that mean? And what is your standing in society? What is your standing in the church? Things that are so familiar and common to you, all of a sudden, you have to learn anew. You go to church. Usually I went to church with my wife together. All of a sudden I'm alone. So with whom will I sit in church? With whom will I connect? These are some questions, the very practical questions. And then there are many other questions as well. You feel, you're lonely now. And how do you cope with that? You feel that you have to learn so many new things that you didn't do before. You didn't have the responsibility to carry. I had to learn to cook. I had to learn to do the chores at home, to do the laundry, to iron the laundry, to keep the house running, so to speak, to care for my children who were still there. My youngest son was only 10, almost 11 years old when that happened. So these are all kinds of questions that swirl through your mind.
Well, Frank, this is, I know this has been hard, and you've raised a very important question about the identity. This seems to be a theme that I've run into as I've talked to people who have lost a spouse. How did you find meaning and hope, even joy perhaps, if that's your case, in the suffering? How has hope, have you regained that hope after losing your loved one?
That's a good question. It's not an easy path.
No.
If you're confronted with significant loss like that, it shakes you to the core, and it really swirls everything around in your life, and it's an up and down. But what really has helped me significantly to deal with that, and this is something that really needs time and you cannot speed it up. You cannot just fast forward and say, okay, I'll do it the fast way and I'll save some time on that. No, it hits you, and it just needs time. Just as love needs time to grow, you need time to mourn the loss of a loved one. And what really has helped me after some time living through that experience is when I received a letter from a good friend of my wife, and she recounted how she had to deal with difficulties, unexpected difficulties in her life. The death of a relative, cancer, divorce with some of her children, and things like that. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that what has happened to me has actually is part of my life. And to accept that reality, Larry, really, that was a tough one, because this was something that I didn't want to have. This was something that I didn't choose. That was something that I've never envisioned for the second part of my life, so to speak. This was something that I did not like to have. And yet it had become part of my life.
Have you been able to move from that to a kind of is a sense of healing from that?
Yes, it was an inner struggle for me to deal with that, because you'd like to live in a state of denial, really, where you deny that this actually is part of your life, that you do not want to accept that. And once you do that, you're never able to really cope with it. You're never able to integrate that experience into your life, and you live in a fake world, so to speak. But the moment you face it, and the moment you admit it, and the moment you tackle it and actually accept it, it was for me as if a burden fell off my shoulders. And I could finally say, yes, this is actually who I am. This is part of my life. This is me. And this makes me, Frank, to the person who I am, and makes me unique. No other person has that experience.
If I hear you right, you're talking about moving from a denial to an acceptance, and that was part of the healing process.
Oh, yes. First you live in a state where you're clouded. I mean, this is like in a fog. You don't think this is real. And as time goes on, you realize, oh yes, this is very much reality now, and you have to face that. And some people, they continue to stay in a state of denial. They keep and preserve the room of their child as if it would still be alive, as if nothing had changed, as if that incident had never happened, and they never progress to a level where they actually integrate that experience into life and into their own experience.
Well, I want to thank you, Frank, for sharing. There's so much more that I want to ask you, so much more that you have to share. What you've done is opened some doors and some new thoughts, but I think perhaps what you have shared today will touch many hearts, because many people are also searching for a sense of identity, moving from denial to acceptance. Thank you very much for sharing, Frank. We've appreciated your sharing, and also just our friendship over the years, and for your work with us on the Bereavement for Spousal Loss Task Force that is going on. So thank you again. We'll be in touch with you more. God bless.
God bless.
During the past several months, we have all been faced with some very challenging times. Many have lost a loved one or have seen them suffer from the pandemic. I want to thank you for joining us today as Dr. Hamel shared her experience of finding joy in her own moments of suffering. As we heard today, loss is not something that goes away, but we are not left without hope. We are not alone. God still has a plan for us. God is with us. It has been said, God gave us memory so that we might have roses in December. Well, in my part of the world, flowers don't normally grow in December. The proverb reminds us that memories can carry us through difficult times. The old saying is true. Grief is the price we pay for love. We should cherish those memories. We have seen that grief is not our enemy, but a reminder of the special moments we've had. Today's webinar was developed by Adventist Possibility Ministries because we know many homes around the world are suffering hurt and pain caused by the loss of a loved one. This raises a number of questions. What really is Possibility Ministries? Who are we, and what drives us to do what we do? The ministry was developed because so many feel they are alone. Some have lost loved ones, others have been abused, while still others live with a stigma that has left them feeling as though they don't fit in anywhere. This is a ministry of compassion, built around the principle of possibility thinking. This is possible because we believe every person was created with a God-given dignity. That understanding changes everything. Out of that, we have developed 7 possibility ministries. Bereavement for spousal loss, blind and low vision, caregiver support, deaf and hard of hearing, mental health and wellness, orphans and vulnerable children, and finally, those with physical and mobility challenges. Possibility Ministries is not a program. It is a dynamic movement which is constantly growing and developing. It is a way of thinking and possibly reshaping how you and I see and relate to ourselves and to others. It is a thoughtful way of revealing the love of Christ to those who are often neglected, rejected, or marginalized. We believe we have just begun to see the possibilities God has in store for each of us. It doesn't matter if we can't see, walk, hear. The Bible teaches us that all are gifted, needed, and treasured. That is the reality the world needs to understand. To find out more about how you can be part of this ministry, go to our website, possibilityministries.org. That's possibilityministry.org. Join our network of possibility believers. Whoever you are, wherever you are, let me assure you, you are needed. We need you, and so does our world. Together, you and I can make a difference. Let's begin changing our world one person at a time.